So Blake Winter is our speaker today, actually part of our Patreon community, long-standing part of that community. And why don't you start off by giving us a little bit of background about yourself? You teach in a different field, right?
Yeah, so my actual degree is in mathematics. Uh, I study topology, and specifically what I do, I can actually put this in cowboy terms, sort of. I can say I use essentially lassos to try to control higher dimensional cows if cows were tangled up objects in higher dimensions. And
Uh,
yeah,
wait,
so this
so
obviously has nothing to do with swords.
although I'm curious what the cows are in this analogy.
They can generally higher dimensional spheres. So like think about a ball, but bump up the dimensions and things like that. Or sometimes Taurus is tangled up in four-dimensional space, things like this. But
All right,
usually what I'm teaching is I'm teaching people how to do algebra, calculus, that sort of thing.
this actually sounds fascinating on its own.
It is a very interesting topic.
Well, this is something we could perhaps come back to.
I start this video by thanking my Patreon supporters who help make it possible for me to make a living teaching subjects of my expertise in the world's most beautiful places. And to everyone who buys my books, thank you so much.
Um, but you have a strong interest in Viking Age swords, which is what you were going to present on for us today
Yes.
and answer some questions for us about. So, how did you develop this interest and
So I guess, my whole life I've been exposed to stories of the Norse. My grandfather was very proud of his Swedish heritage. I remember hearing stories. The first two stories that I remember for some reason are the story of the Frodi's mill getting dumped into the sea and producing salt, and the story of the king or jarl who sentenced somebody to death by overgorging themselves because he kept eating after the king was finished.
wow, those are deep cuts, relatively speaking, especially the second one.
Yeah, it's so weird that those are the ones that I remember. And I think they stood out to me because I was like, wow, these sound so stupid. Like, because they kind of do to us as modern readers, right? Like, they're really strange, uh, odd things to think about. So anyway, and then, throughout school and college, I was always interested in nerdy stuff, Tolkien, Beowulf, all that sort of thing. And then I really got back into Viking stuff, actually, partly uh, because of something that you worked on, the Assassin's Creed Valhalla game that my wife bought me. And I really love the game. It's a great game, but I looked at it and I thought, I think this is not entirely historically accurate. I'd like to learn more about what the actual uh historical conditions were like and things like that. And it's a great, it doesn't have to be accurate, right? It's supposed to be a fun game. It's supposed to take historical liberties. That's perfectly acceptable in a game like that to do. But it made me return to this interest, and this developed into this thought that, hey, I'd like to collect a Viking sword. And then I started looking into it, and it seemed like most of the replicas on the market were not very good. So I started studying what the swords were like, and this sort of snowballed
Mm.
um, into a really deep interest in the archaeology behind Viking and migration era swords and other artifacts, not just swords. It's just swords are my main focus and knowledge.
I think that it's interesting how academics tend to approach a lot of their hobbies like an academic subject.
Yes, this is particularly true for me. If I get fixated on something, I really get fixated on it.
Yeah.
And
I mean, same. Like I'm relating to it, and I'm
Yeah.
also, thinking of several other people I've known. It seems to be like a personality trait that you
Yes.
bring this sort of, you know.
That's what a psychiatrist once told me. Yes.
Okay. Well, I
But
think
yes,
it's a
so my academic background is totally unrelated to, well, not totally unrelated. I also have a background in physics, but what I bring to this is a very mathematical, analytical mindset when I approach the historical data. And that will actually come up because later on I will have a chance to talk about something that I recently did using statistical analysis with Viking swords. So,
okay. Well, can you give us a kind of a historical survey then of, you mentioned migration age two, so migration age, Viking age swords, like what are we looking at in terms of, is the design changing over time? Are the particular characteristics
yes, it absolutely is, although primarily what changes is the design of the hilts. And am I able to share screen here?
yeah, you should be.
Because
Let
this
me
is
make
one of
sure.
those things that I think it's easier if you can see what I'm talking about rather than just trying to listen to my descriptions.
Of course,
So let me see.
you're co-host, so you should be able to.
Okay, I'm just bad at using Zoom, so hold on a second.
Oh, I am too.
uh, all right, so can everybody see
Yeah, yeah.
something now? So let me go down here and we can take a look at a few of the different types of swords. And just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here, how do I make this thing full screen? There we go. So we should probably say a few things about the terminology, just because we'll be using these terms a lot. So these swords of this era tended to have more parts around where you grip the sword than we're used to thinking about. Most people probably think about a medieval sword as having, you have the grip itself, you have a pommel, and then you have a guard that goes over your hand and keeps people from whacking your hand, basically. The Viking era swords were a little bit more involved than this. So a lot of them, not all of them had all of these parts, but many of them would have a grip, and then on either end, they would have a guard. The one by the blade is called the lower guard. The one by the base of your hand, the end of your palm, is called the upper guard. And then on top of that, they would have a pommel cap. We'll get into why they did this later. There are actually good reasons. They didn't just kind of say, let's make this more complicated than it needs to be. And then we have the blade itself. And if the blade has a indentation running down the middle, that is called a fuller. I did try to get the Old Norse names for these, so I actually think they're a little bit more appropriate in some cases. So, for example, they call the upper guard it eftrahjaltet and the lower guard it fremrehjaltet, which I think is better than upper and lower because it's like the front guard and the back guard, or front hilt, back hilt, I think.
Yeah, like
Something along
after and
those lines.
forward. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Which makes more sense to me because otherwise I'm always thinking, wait, is upper the one that's upwards when the
Right.
sword is sitting blade down, or is it upward when I'm holding the sword? And now
Right.
I'm used to it, but it's more confusing. And then some of them, if you look on the right-hand side here, have got this fancy vetrim, uh, little rings of metal around part of the grip itself. So that's another thing that you can see. By the way, the fuller in Old Norse is called the blodreifel, which I think means something like the blood groove or blood something.
Yeah, I always wondered about that, whether it actually had something to do with, blood.
No, it doesn't. It's weird though, because the Germanic languages tend to say it does. I think it seems to come from a misunderstanding that somehow it's going to make a person bleed more. It's actually there to give the sword a little bit of the shape of an I-beam. So if you think about a piece of metal that's thin in one direction, it will very easily bend in that direction. So how do you fix that? Well, you have to make it a little thicker. But if you want to have something that can cut like a blade, then you can only make it thicker in the middle. Well, you get a lot more benefit from the parts that are way thicker, but you also add a lot more weight. So what you can do is you can cut out a piece in the middle and it gives a little bit of an I-beam shape in the middle of the sword that saves some weight. So it's really a weight saving device more than anything else, I think. But
That
it
makes
ends
sense.
up being called the blood groove. Probably because if you get blood on the sword, it will pool in there or something. I don't I don't fully know, but it does seem to be a Germanic staple to call it
And
that.
speaking of weight, how much would one of these weigh?
It depends. So the lightest examples probably weighed about 1,000 grams, so a little over 2 pounds. The heaviest examples would get up to 1,600 to 1,800 grams, so we're talking about over 3 pounds. The very heaviest example that I know of is 2,300 grams, which is really heavy, and the thing looks practically like a crowbar. I
Huh.
don't It's this sword from Finland that it's oversized in all its dimensions, except the length of the grip. We'll talk about the length of the grip at some point here. But yeah, I don't know why that sword is so heavy. Uh, a blacksmith friend of mine, Björn Gilvason, whose work we'll be seeing a few examples of here, and I were joking about how it's like for when you're on a raid and you don't want to carry a separate crowbar to open up the chests. So you just get this really heavy sword that
Well,
can rip through anything.
it is kind of astonishing. I mean, no matter how strong you are, there's a lot of advantages to something that you can swing more times. So,
Yes. Um, yeah, but they're not as light as some people think. They're also not as heavy as some people think. They're
hmm,
definitely not as light as a late medieval Renaissance, or I guess I should say like Renaissance or running up into the Napoleonic age, Victorian age, like those small sword type things. Those tended to be a bit lighter. So a lot of people nowadays will say, "Oh my God, how these Viking swords are too heavy." And that's one of the issues. A lot of the replicas go for the very lightest examples that we have,
hmm,
um, because that's what modern customers want. They're kind of used to the Victorian era small sword weights of swords, and they don't want to have a heavier sword. The examples that I own tend to be in the 1,400 to 1,600 gram range.
but I think the first thing I analogize this to is it sounds like the weight range is about the same as a fully loaded, full size semi automatic pistol. So it's about the same as what you'd be wearing on your belt if you're a combatant today.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's not so much about the weight on the belt, it's about the weight when you're swinging it around, right?
right,
Because
right,
a pistol doesn't sit away from your hand, it sits nicely in your hand, right?
right,
It's fairly easy to hold a pistol. With a sword, you have to actually swing the thing around, and the center of balance is not in your hand like it is with a pistol,
right,
or not
right.
close to your hand. But yeah, actually, this is an interesting comparison, not so much to the Vikings, but when people talk about later plate armor of the medieval ages, people often think that knights were very heavily armored and must not have been able to move. And the truth is that their kit weighs about the same as what the most lightly equipped US soldier carries.
Oh,
But that's later on. Now, the Vikings would have been wearing much less armor than that at
right,
during that time period.
right.
So
Oh,
these are the parts of the sword. And then why does this go on to the grip? Sorry, I'm skipping around here to answer the question about the different types. So let's go down here. So starting out here with the pre Viking era, so approximately 500 to 750 AD, what we see is swords in the Germanic part of the world and all over Northern Europe. Because one thing that I should say here is that there's no such thing as a strictly Scandinavian sword. All of these swords were traded extensively around Northwestern Europe, all the way down into the Mediterranean, all the way over into what is now Russia and the Ukraine. There are some local trends, but there's nothing where we can say this is an exclusively Viking sword. And that goes for these earlier swords as well. We cannot say these are exclusively Scandinavian swords. They are heavily influenced by the Roman spatha, not the more famous gladius, but the spatha from the later Roman imperial periods. So a somewhat longer cutting blade. And they went through a variety of different styles of decorating the hilt. And the one that I want to focus on primarily, because it actually relates very closely to a somewhat confusing passage in the Poetic Edda, is the Bemmer Type 6, also because it's kind of the fanciest sword the Scandinavians ever used. So if you look at these examples, you can see two of these three are extremely decorated, gold plated. I think they're gold plated. I can't be sure about that. Pretty sure they're gold plated, but maybe it's just some kind of shiny bronze. And then they have all these garnet inlays. The migration era Scandinavians and also Anglo-Saxons really, really liked their garnets. So their solution to the problem of what should we do to decorate this is always just more garnets, it seems. And the one on the right, the Vendelgrave 12, is much less decorated, but it's very clearly got a very similar kind of shape. Now, what's interesting about these Bemmer Type 6s is that sometimes they get these big rings on them, on the hilts. And nobody actually knows for sure what those were for, but I think that this might explain a weird passage in, I always get the three Helgi poems mixed up, so maybe you can remind me. I think this is the first Hundingsbana, where they talk about
yeah,
this.
I think so.
It's one of them. I should have looked this up, and then I didn't. Anyway,
I'm gonna
so
check.
this is when I think it's Svolva is telling him about this great sword that he can go get, and she says, "Sverd veit ik ligga I Sigersholmi hringer hjalti." And this doesn't make a lot of sense. There's a ring in the hilt. What does that even mean? I have even seen one translator who amended this to courage in the hilt. Which one
It's
is it?
in Hjorbardssonar.
Ah,
You said
okay.
Swova, which is kind of the
Yes, I remember the Valkyrie names. I never remember the actual, because the thing is, the name of the poem never really comes up in the poem. Like it's usually a very brief reference, I think. Like, oh, and he killed Hunding, and then we, or something like this.
right.
Anyway,
So it stands at 10 is where we get the ring is in the hill. So what is I'm looking at the picture there. What is the ring? What
can you see my mouse on the screen?
yeah. Okay,
Okay,
so it's
so
this
it's
like
this.
side thing?
Yeah, so these are somewhat later examples. In the earlier examples, they literally look like two rings linked together. In
Huh.
the later examples, they got thicker and they became these like two fused rings.
Huh.
And we have no idea what they're for, but I'm reasonably sure that this is what they're talking about in those poems, because I can't think of anything else in any Viking age or pre-Viking swords that involves a ring being near the hilt. But
Huh.
I think this idea of the ring, it was obviously very important because they would take swords with really fancy hilts and they would cut off part of the decoration to add this ring. So they
Must
really
add some
cared about
weight.
it. Yes, and it seems very inconvenient to have. It doesn't serve any practical purpose that we can figure out. It it's sort of decorative, I guess, but not really. Like it doesn't look that great to us today, I don't think. Um, and we just don't know what they were for. The best guess that people have come up with is based on the fact that some of them were added later, some of them were taken off at certain points, and they seem to be primarily in upper class graves, but not usually in the graves of the actual Drottningar, whatever you call the leader at that time, the Jarl or chieftain or king. It seems likely that they may have been an indication that you were a sworn member of some leader's inner circle or something like this. And then if you decided that you were ditching your leader, you would take the ring off or something like that. Um,
Hmm.
so that's the best guess that we can come up with, but it's still very open as to what that really means. I do think, though, that this may tell us what's going on in that Helgi poem, which is otherwise very confusing.
Yeah, I never had any idea what that was about.
So
I mean,
if this is true, then it tells us something about the dating of the poem, that it was very early, or possibly more likely, it tells us that there was a memory of this type of sword that had fallen out of use. And this was sort of a trope to say, oh, this is a really old and therefore awesome heirloom sword in the poem.
yeah, and it's worth noting that, of course, in any old Germanic language, ring and hilt alliterate, right? So,
Yes.
like in Old Norse, hringar and hjalti, hringa eri hjalti. Um, so it could survive as kind of a poetic formula. But
Yeah, it absolutely could. Maybe the poet themselves didn't really understand what they were referencing, but I'm guessing it has
yeah,
its originations at least in something about these types of ring-hilted swords.
yeah, that's just. I mean, you look at it and it is so weird. I mean,
It
it's
is.
just
It's really strange. Yeah. Like I said, some of them are a bit smaller and are actual rings, but the later examples like these are just these thick, solid lumps that are vaguely ring-shaped and no ideas beyond that it must have had maybe had some kind of indication of where you stood in society and
and
your
and
loyalties.
when was this the thing to have? When were these
This would have
popular?
been slightly pre-Viking age, so probably in the 600s to early 700s.
Hmm.
Uh, which is why I say that this might indicate the poet is either bringing in something from as you suggested, a previous formula, or maybe they are indicating that this is an old and therefore awesome sword. It could be something like that because they gave up on this before the Viking Age. They got rid of having these kinds of rings on the swords.
Hmm. Huh. I mean,
And then, oh,
it.
sorry, go on.
How widespread was this? Was this throughout the Germanic-speaking world, or was this like a particular area where this was popular?
So it's interesting because we see the same kinds of swords, this same Bemer type 6 swords over in Anglo-Saxon England. And yeah, we find rings there as well in
Huh.
some of them. So it's not just. So these examples, I believe, both come from Sweden. There's a lot found in Uppsala, however you say that. I visited the place and still can't say the name. Um, so there's a lot of Vendel age burials there, and so we get a lot of these examples from there. But yeah, they were found at least over into England. I don't know about them being found in Germany or Denmark, though. I would
Huh.
have to check into that.
Well, so it was a fashion that was getting around,
Yeah,
uh,
yeah, and this
including
is
at a
one of the
time.
interesting things about studying this, right? Is you find that there are these fashions that really spread across Europe. It wasn't usually a local. Now, there may have been local preferences. You might find that a certain fashion was much more common in one place than another, but you find a lot of the same stuff all
Mhm.
over the place, even in the pre-Viking age. So there's some connection there. Everybody's trading with the same third party, everybody's trading with each other. Something's going on there.
Yeah. Huh. What a curious thing.
So if we go on to the Viking Age, the classification is usually done following a Norwegian scholar named Jan Pedersen, and he gave a classification system that runs from A to Ash. So it consists of many different types. The grips are generally 8 to 10 centimeters long. They often have kind of larger, more clumsy looking guards and pommel caps than the modern reproductions choose to go with. And we already talked about the weight and everything. So really quickly, I have some pictures of the main types that we have. They're semi-roughly chronologically ordered. Some of them are fairly simplistic, like the A and B types are mostly made of just plain iron hilts and fashioned into rough triangles. Some of them are much fancier, as we will see later. For instance, the type H and type I, very fancy. The type Ls tend to be quite fancy. Type D is extremely fancy. And then later on, we get more types of swords. There's more development of the hilt. The type S is extremely fancy. Some of these are, of course, still quite simple, like the type Q. That one's fairly simple. The type Ys are relatively simple. Type X's, not too complicated. And yeah, so there is some debate over whether Peterson's classification system can be improved a little bit, but it's kind of incremental improvements because he did a very good job of summarizing all of the different types of sword hilts that we see in the Viking Age. And you might wonder, why are we talking about the hilt rather than the blade? Well, the answer is because during the Viking Age, there was not that much change in the blades. Let me go to my blade summary here really quick.
And
Um,
the hill types here, is there any kind of chronological sense to those?
yeah, I will talk about that in a bit. It's complicated though. It's very difficult to get a definite sense of dating things. But yes, Peterson tried to give them in roughly chronological order to some extent, but a lot of them are overlapping. A lot of them follow sort of parallel evolution. Um, but the reason we care so much about the hilts over the blades is because the blades didn't actually change all that much over the Viking Age. We see relatively wide one-handed swords. They tend to be about 70 to 84 centimeters long in the blade itself, and they tend to balance about a fifth of the way down the blade. They tend to have moderately wide fullers that go most of the length of the blade. And there's only some very subtle differences between the blade types. In fact, Okasha, who is sort of the grandfather of classifying medieval swords, puts all Viking swords into a single type, the Oakshot type 10. But Alfred Geibig, a German researcher, kind of broke down the Viking swords into 5 different types. And the type 1 is sort of the one that has the least tapering to the blade, so it stays quite wide all the way to the tip. Type 2 has a bit more taper. The fuller remains quite wide. Type 3 is similar to a Type 2, except that the fuller tapers a bit more. Type 4 is a little bit shorter and has a much more pronounced taper. And then Type 5 has the more pronounced taper, but it's longer. And as I said, these are all still quite similar. And we find different hilts on all these different types of blades. So there's probably certain hilt types that we don't find on particular types of blades, but in general, it's kind of all over the place. So it's very difficult to classify Viking swords by their blades. That's why we do it by the hilts. The rest of the stuff didn't seem to change all that much. I should also mention that Type 4 and 5 did not really appear until very close to, well, maybe not very close, but at least until the latter half of the 900s, we don't think. Although the researcher Feder Androshuk thinks that Geibig was a little overly optimistic when he said that he could give a chronology for these sword blades, and thinks that we might need to be more cautious about assigning definite time periods to these blades, and maybe some of them cropped up earlier and stayed longer than Geibig suggested. So there's a little bit of uncertainty there, and I do really recommend Androshuk's book if you can get a copy of it. It's very difficult to get a hold of, but if you can, it's really awesome. He has all kinds of stuff in there about not just swords, but about the decoration of the scabbards and other things, and how you can date swords chronologically, and it's a really interesting read.
And what is it called?
It's called Viking Swords. I have a whole list of references, and I'll make this set of slides available afterwards. So it's, Swords and Social Aspect of Weaponry in Viking Age Societies. And it's published by the Statens Historiska Museet in Stockholm. The problem is that it is out of print. And I think they printed about 10 copies or something. It's like an absurdly small number. Like, I'm exaggerating, but effectively they printed 10 copies. In order to get a hold of one, I had to have my employer, the college I was working at the time, get one by interlibrary loan. And they said there's like 5 copies in all of North America.
Looks like Stella has a link to it on
sorry.
academia.edu. And
that is it, but it's not the whole thing. It's like the introduction. Unless you've managed to find the whole thing available, which would be awesome. Sorry, I'm just checking this real quick. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, so he just posted like the introduction to his thing on academia.edu so that you can sort of see what the book is about. But the book itself is like 800 pages, something like that. Like I said, it's a really good book. And I've taken a lot of this information from that book. But like I said, so I had to get it through interlibrary loan. The first library lost it, so now there's only 4 copies in North America. The second copy came from the Library of Congress, and I was warned that if anything happened to it, I would be hanged, drawn, and quartered. And yeah, so it is not an easy book to get a hold of. And so, but I can try to help people get information from it if they have questions. So yeah, that kind of gives us a bit of the development of the swords. Um, by the way, so something that I should mention here is why people might care about this if you're interested in language and mythology and the sagas, because a lot of people get into this because they're interested in the stories, which are these great stories about real people, or purportedly about real people, right? There's this real human drama element to the Icelandic sagas and to the Norse stories that is very interesting. But then people are like, well, I just don't really care that much about the weapons they were using. But I think that there are still reasons to care. One of them is because, like I said, if you understand this thing about the uh, rings in the sword, then that gives you some idea of what this weird poetic passage means. Another is because the swords were really important in this culture. Swords have been important in a lot of cultures, and I think it's because, unlike other weapons, like a spear or an axe that can be used for chores, hunting or chopping wood or whatever, a sword is really only something that's useful for war. So if you have it, it shows that you have the resources to be a warrior. It's also small enough and comfortably enough that you can wear it around pretty much any time. And we have archaeological evidence that they wore their swords a lot, because there are these wear patterns on the hilts that show that somebody was constantly putting their hand on one side of it. Like they're resting their hand on their hip right on the sword as they're walking around or standing around or drinking in the mead hall. So you can use them as this way to show I am a warrior. And if you have a decorated hilt, you can say, I'm not just a warrior, I'm also like rich, kind of like I'm driving the Ferrari of swords
Right.
type thing. So if we want to understand their culture, it helps us to understand an item that was clearly of central importance to them. It also helps us to understand the trade relations and the cultural trends that were going on during the time. And finally, if we want to understand how the Vikings lived, I think one of the best tools at our disposal is something called experimental archaeology, which requires us to have really accurate reproductions of the items that the Vikings actually used. Experimental archaeology is something a lot of people maybe don't know a whole lot about. I feel like it's a bit of a fringe field that is, I don't know this for sure because I'm not in the archaeological circles, but I don't know how many traditional archaeologists think much of experimental archaeology. I think it's a really good idea. The idea behind it is to try to recreate artifacts and then see what we can actually do with them.
Hmm.
And what this can do is it can help us see what was possible with these artifacts, at least assuming we figure out how, maybe we don't figure it out, but at least if we figure something out, then we can say this is a possible thing that could be done with this artifact. Now, that doesn't mean somebody did it. We have to be very careful here, because just because you can do something doesn't mean anybody ever wanted to or would think to do that. Um, an analogy you could think of, like, you could drive almost any car across a rocky field, but nobody does that. They just drive on pavement, right? So like if some alien archaeologist came and said, well, here's a car and here's all the things I can do with this car, so clearly this is what people do with cars, that's probably not true. So we do have to be careful. We have to compare this to what the sources tell us and things like this. But the point is that we need to study the original artifacts in order to understand what they're like if we want to try to understand how they were used. And a good example of this connects to the question that Kathy posted, if you don't mind me jumping to that, about shields. So I think it was Kathy, right? She asked about the sizes of shields on Patreon.
Check.
Anyway, somebody asked, how big were the shields? Were there small shields, or are they all as big as people usually portray? And the answer is, yeah, they were pretty big. They were usually, I think, between 70 and 95 centimeters, the ones that we found. So that's like from well over 2 feet to about 3+ feet in diameter. So yes, they were quite large shields, but what's interesting is the confusion about shields that sort of somehow uh, got into the thinking about Viking Age shields. So because these shields were made of slats of wood and they didn't have plywood or anything laminate like that we know of, people looked at this and they said, well, I can split a slat of wood by smacking it with an axe or a sword. So these shields were probably useless for defending. And so somebody came up with this idea that actually what this 3-foot diameter shield was for punching your opponent, and it really didn't have much to do with defending yourself, which to me sounds like a kind of a weird idea. I don't quite know why you would come to that conclusion. But then people said, well, probably they covered these things with leather or cloth of some kind, because we do have evidence of cloth or leather being on the shields, at least some of the shields. And they found that when you do that, when you glue a layer of leather onto a shield that's made of wood, it becomes incredibly strong and very defensive. And Rolf Varming from the Society for Combat Archaeology, which is one of the coolest names of any organization that I think I've ever heard, has studied this, as have William Short and Runier Oskarsson from the Hurstvik organization. They've been on this channel before being interviewed. And they both found that when you make these shields, cover them with hide, and then you attack them with arrows, spears, swords, even a two-handed axe, the shield remains functional and defensive. So by just saying, well, probably they had leather on here, let's test what happens if there's leather or cloth in addition to just the wood, it completely changes our perspective of what these shields were capable of. And I think that's why the experimental archaeology is so important, because if we're just sort of sitting there staring at an artifact and thinking about it, we don't really know what that artifact was capable of doing. So, but we do have to be careful that we don't assume just because it can be done that it would be done.
Right. But I think it is a valuable field of inquiry. I think that the Hurstvik guys we've talked to a few times do a good job with it and are responsible about it. And some archaeologists have shown a lot of interest in what they find, like Arvan Gudmundsson at the University of Iceland, or the National Museum of Iceland, who's been on this channel before too. So
I hope that it's catching on among the more mainstream academics. It sort of seems like it is, maybe, but
the trick seems to be not dressing up when you do it. That helps you stay on the right side of respectability.
Yes. I think the Hurstvik guys do like to dress up when they do it, or maybe that's just for the pictures in their book.
I think it's just for the pictures, actually.
Okay.
I don't think they normally do.
Okay. They do extensive testing, though. In fact, let me say another really great resource is this book here, Men of Terror, which they've mentioned on here when they were interviewed, that they were writing this, because I think you interviewed them before this was published and then after this was published. But yeah, really good book. Everybody should get it. It's not super expensive and it has so much great information in there, some of which we will get to a little bit later. What is going on? Okay, there we go.
And it was Kathy who asked about the shield too, right?
Okay, yeah. So I don't have a whole lot more to say about shields. We could actually talk extensively about the design of the shield bosses and things like this, but this is primarily focused on swords. So I will leave it at all the evidence suggests that they tended to only use rather large shields, nothing like a late medieval buckler or, dinner plate sized shield. That doesn't mean they didn't. Maybe they did at some point have that kind of thing. But we don't have any evidence from picture stones or from manuscript drawings or from written sources or from archaeology that I am aware of suggesting anything but the mid to large round shield.
Mm-hmm.
I should also mention, I forgot to say, I'm mostly talking about the double-edged swords here. There were also some single-edged swords, but for whatever reason, we mostly find them in Norway and Gotland. And what the connection is here is beyond me. And I think beyond other people too. I don't think I'm like missing something that is known. I think this is kind of a mystery. why these two particular places like to have some single-edged swords.
It could be a shared uh, conservative cultural feature rather than a shared innovation. I mean, they're
It
both
probably was. It seems like they went away over time rather than coming in over time. So it may have been a shared conservative thing. It may have been, so single-edged swords are easier to make than double-edged, so they were cheaper. So it may have simply been that in Norway and Gotland, poorer people were more likely to buy a sword.
Mm-hmm.
It may also
Yeah.
be survivor bias. So one of the problems in archaeology is we only have the stuff that got preserved. So if a bunch of like let's say a bunch of poorer Swedish people had single-edged swords, and then when they got damaged, they melted down the iron to make nails, then we don't have a sword anymore, right? Like, so there are all kinds of it's a little bit like trying to know where the runes came from, right? We've got all of these plausible hypotheses and no conclusive evidence one way or the other.
Right. Well, you also, I mean, it could have to do with just where the money was, you know, Norway and Gotland both strike me as being a little bit peripheral in that early period. I mean, this is long before
the Swedes were definitely richer, right?
Yeah.
The Vendel area, that's where we find the super fancy swords and the super fancy helmets and all the really like high end stuff. And then Norway does seem like a little bit more of a poorer region. It might also be that Sweden continued to have a little bit of that poorer people don't need weapons thing that Tacitus talks about. Of course, that's like 5 centuries before, 6 centuries before the migration period, but maybe that got preserved. I seem to remember him saying that the Svear do not allow poor people to own swords or something like this. So who knows? But it's one of those curious mysteries that hopefully somebody will be able to solve for us if we find more evidence for it, what actually was happening. And speaking of the trade, because this segues nicely, if you don't mind me going into this next little bit here, the steel that you use for swords is really, really important. And where they got the swords and the swords blades is something that is a matter of debate. So when we're talking about the steel for swords, I've included a little phase diagram here for those of you who might want to try this at home. And I will straight up tell you right now that I have, in addition to a PhD in mathematics, I have a bachelor of science in physics and mathematics. This diagram confuses me to no end. So, okay, that's a little bit of an exaggeration. I kind of understand what the phase diagram is saying. What I less understand is why the phase diagram is the way it is. But my point is that if you don't understand this, it is not because, oh, this is obvious and you're just not getting it. It's not at all obvious. Essentially, when you make steel for swords, you want to make sure that your steel is relatively homogeneous. Now, the reason for this is because when you make steel, you tend to get what's called slag inclusions, which is like detritus from the smelting process. And that can create a weak spot in your blade. Well, what you want to do is you want to make sure the steel is as homogeneous as possible. The best way to do this is to actually liquefy the steel, but that's really, really hard to do because it takes very, very high temperatures. And the only people at that time who were really doing that, and I don't think they were doing it in super high quantities, were some people over in India and possibly Iran. Although we do have a recipe for melting steel found in Alexandria in northern Africa that's over 2,000 years old. So I don't, it's a very confusing and contentious topic where exactly crucible steel, melted steel was made and when it was made. But most of the steel that the Europeans were using was what was called bloomery steel, where you don't actually ever fully liquefy the steel. So you want to try to make it as homogeneous as possible. You also need to have just the right amount of carbon in there, because too little and you'll end up with a sword that can't be hardened. Too much and you end up with something that is too brittle and it will break easily when you hit things with it. And then it's not enough to just have the carbon there. You have to get it into the correct molecular structure. So the idea is at low temperatures, iron likes to be in what is called a body-centered cubic structure that we see down here. At higher temperatures, it goes into a face-centered cubic structure. For reasons that are not clear to me, once it becomes face-centered cubic, the carbon atoms can move around into the molecular structure much more easily. So even if you don't fully liquefy the steel, you can get your carbon to diffuse amongst the iron atoms.
Hmm.
And then if you cool it down quickly enough, instead of the carbon just coming back out, what you end up with is you end up either getting the carbon atoms stuck in there and producing something called martensite, which is very hard. And that's if you cool really, really quickly. If you cool it more slowly, then you will end up with pieces of iron carbide. So molecules formed of, I think it's 3 iron and 1 carbon atom, Fe3C. And these pieces of iron carbide, you may have heard of like iron carbide drill bits and things that are used when you need something really hard. They are very, very hard. And if you get them interlaced with your iron, it produces this sort of laminate material that becomes both very hard and yet still somewhat flexible. And if you want to then make your sword less brittle, then what you can do is you can heat it up again, but not as much, which allows the molecular structure to relax a bit. Now, all of this does not really matter for us any more than it did to them. We can ultimately just conclude that it's essentially magic, and this is why the Smiths were often referred to as elves or Dwargar, right? We see that smithing is associated with magical beings. And I think that's because doing this stuff when you have no clue about what molecules are, what chemistry is, or even when you do know something about chemistry, it just seems like magic.
Sure.
And it's easy to just say, hey, it's magical. The Smiths have a magical skill. And by the way, thank you to Ranveg for letting me harass her boyfriend with questions about this stuff to clarify my understanding, because this is really confusing stuff.
Because he is he's a swordsmith, right? Or like
no,
iron...
he's just a material scientist.
Oh, okay.
And he also had questions for me about the steel of swords, and we ended up going down some rabbit holes that were very interesting, but that we don't need to get into right here. So once you get your steel, in order to homogenize it, what you can do is this technique called piling, or in German, it's called gerben or gerben. And the old Germanic word may have been gerven. Maybe you would know more about this.
Oh no, I'm trying to think of what that would come from. It could be related to Old Norse gorva, like just do, make, gear up, prepare.
Possibly. Is there any word for like a sheaf or something like this?
Did you say sheaf or sheaf?
Sheaf, like a sheaf of wheat, like a bunch of wheat stalks put together.
Oh, of course, but that's sheaf. I mean, it's the same.
Okay.
It's almost the same word in
anyway,
English. Yeah.
I was thinking of this because there's the word like gerb or gerb that means something like this. The point is, I don't know where this came from, and maybe I'm wrong about the words here, but the Japanese are famous for folding steel, right? I don't know if you've ever heard of like, oh, the old katana masters would fold the steel 1,000 times, right? If maybe you're not as exposed to Japanese nerdy culture, but
one of my weird little factoids is I did kendo for
really
almost all of high school. Yeah.
Oh, fun. Okay, so maybe you've heard this about how their katana blacksmiths would fold the steel 1,000 times and whatnot, and that's essentially what we're talking about here.
Then they would cut spaceships,
right?
In half.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So the thing is, the Japanese swordsmiths, they're amazing. They really do incredible work, but they're not doing something that's like qualitatively different than what other swordsmiths knew how to do throughout history. It's the same kind of idea. Yes, they're very, very good at it. They do it amazingly well, but so did the Celtic smiths 2,000 years ago. Because really all you're doing is it's like taking a piece of dough and you fold it, roll it out, fold it, roll it out, and this homogenizes it. And you can see here a picture that compares Japanese steel to a piece of Celtic steel. And you can see, yeah, there's differences, but they're not major differences. They're still essentially this like wood grain pattern going through the steel.
Mhm.
The other thing that I do want to mention is you don't literally fold the steel 1,000 times. And the reason for this is because every time you do a fold, you double the number of layers. So if you start with just one layer of steel, folding it 10 times gives you 1,000 layers. So you're really only folding it 10 times. The Japanese smiths do not actually literally fold it 1,000 times, if that's what people are thinking.
Sure.
In fact, you wouldn't want to do that because folding it too many times can have adverse effects. So they have 1,000 layers, yes. 1,000 folds, not exactly. But yeah, so they were doing this kind of technique, and when you get really good at it, you can produce these awesome pattern welded steels that we see on many Viking Age blades. But it's worth pointing out here that the patterns that we see are really just for decoration. They don't really improve the sword itself. What improved the sword is the fact that you've folded this thing over and over again. Doing these patterns is really just for show. And I've shown one example here. This is the KM 20221 that was found in, I have no idea how to pronounce Finnish, so I'm not even going to try it.
Okay, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know enough Finnish to be very good at it. But,
Okay. Sorry to put you on the spot, but this is a really famous pattern welded blade that's actually slightly pre-Viking Age, we think. It's a little difficult to tell, but it has some really cool patterns on it. And then I've also shown on the right-hand side here, there are a few different examples of pattern welding as done by a modern swordsmith named Patrick Barta, who is over, I want to say he's in the Czech Republic, but I could be mistaking him for somebody else. So now I don't want to commit to exactly where he lives, but he's somewhere over in Europe, and he does this incredible work. And this brings us back to the Helgi poems, because in that same passage where Svolva is talking about the sword, she talks about how there is a serpent or dragon on the sword.
mm-hmm.
And
and whatever the Valbost is, I was actually just looking at this in the same text. Jonas Christensen and Jason Oleson's edition of the Poetic poems. That term Valbost, it's not very clear what part of a sword that is.
Let's see. So so that's saying something about there's a snake on the hilt, maybe?
Well, so a painted, blood colored serpent lies along the edge, and on the Valbost, whatever that is, a snake, like it's almost like throws, right? Verpa's throws its tail.
So the snake along the edge, I suspect, refers to this pattern welding that you can see where it looks sort of like a snake undulating down the center of the blade. And it's possible that in the right light, this would sort of look reddish, particularly since they use red to cover kind of a variety of like different sort of bright colors. I mean, I'm sort of guessing here, but it is possible.
Fire.
Yeah, like if it glints in the sunlight, it sort of looks like it's glinting like fire. And for alliterative, poetic reasons, they don't refer to it this way. The Valbuste, I have no idea, but one possibility is that on some of the hilts, they would have stylized animal figures, including things like bears and other animal heads, depending upon exactly the time period we're looking at. So conceivably, one of the decorations on the hilt is sort of a stylized serpent shape. I feel like I've seen examples of that, but I cannot for the life of me remember exactly where. I would have to dig that up more. It's also possible that it is still referring to the blade, and it refers to the fact that the pattern welding changes somewhere along the way and looks like the snake is throwing its tail. I don't know, but this is why I think studying these kinds of things is interesting, studying along with the poem, because we can kind of try to ask ourselves, is the poem actually telling us something very literal about what the sword looked like?
Right.
Rather than thinking this just sounds like a fantasy sword. It might actually be a very realistic description, just a bit of a poetic one for how the sword is decorated.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very curiously put passage, no matter what, starting with that very first line, "A ring's in the hilt." Um, but it could also survive from a much earlier period, right? Sort of these um, poetic formulae about how you talk about swords.
Yes, but there is kind of a consensus among people who have studied this stuff. At least I think there's a consensus. It's certainly not my idea that the references to worms in the sword or snakes in the sword is probably a reference to pattern welding, because it does often come out looking a bit like a snake,
I can
depending on
see
how
it.
you do it.
And it was just occurring to me that maybe this becomes such a formulaic way of talking about it that people forget what it was originally meant to describe. And I think about in one of the sagas of warrior poets, I think it's Cormac's. There's a sword that actually literally has a snake that lives inside of it.
Yeah, so that's an interesting reference, because somebody has actually suggested that might still have been pattern welding, because
I see. Yeah.
depending on how you treat the sword, the pattern may not be very visible. And he
Right. True.
suggests that in order to bring out the visual pattern, you would blow on the sword when it was cold and get condensation on it.
Okay.
And
All
suddenly
right.
the serpent
Interesting.
would appear.
Yeah,
I
I
don't
can
know if
see
that's
it.
true. I mean, this is like pure speculation on his part, but it's an idea.
That's neat.
But
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
I mean, it may also be that it's because wasn't that sword supposed to be like Tierfinger and a really old sword or something?
I think it was maybe supposed to be Rolf Krake's sword.
Yeah. Am I
Because it
confusing? Which one was his sword? I thought it was Tierfinger, but
No, he didn't have Tierfinger. That's from the Saga of Peregrine Haedrick.
oh, you're
I
right.
forgot
Yes.
his sword.
Okay. Okay. I don't remember what his sword was called, but the point is that it was supposed to be like an old sword, so maybe it still had
Yeah.
pattern welding. Because one of the interesting things is pattern welding does kind of go away over time, it seems. And I think there's a good reason for this. It doesn't do anything for your sword except make it look fancy. And so it's expensive, but most of the time people are going to be seeing your sword when it's in its scabbard.
True.
So it makes sense to have a fancy hilt. It makes sense to have a fancy scabbard. It doesn't necessarily make sense to have a fancy blade that will only be seen when you're fighting, when people are less concerned with looking at like the artistic elements on your blade, right? If I
Yeah,
want to
that makes
show
good
off my
sense.
wealth in the mead hall, I want to have a fancy hilt. And we know that they were doing this because there are hilts that are really fancy on one side and really simple on the other.
That's funny.
So you would wear the simple side next to your body where people couldn't see it.
Well, and also you draw your sword in the meat hall, and that's a pretty threatening gesture, even if it's just like, check out my.
Exactly. Like you're not going to be like, "Hey, look how wealthy I am. I've got pattern. Look at my
Yeah,
snake." And
right,
that's not going to go over well.
right. Or
Uh,
you decorate a pistol's grips, not the slide, right?
right. Exactly.
Although
Well,
I
I
guess
guess I was
I've
going to say I've seen
seen,
some pretty crazy
but
pistols.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But yes, it's the same kind of idea. You want to put the decoration where people are likely to see it rather than where they're not. Um, the other thing that you can do to decorate the blade, though, is you can put inlays in it. And the most famous of these inlays are the so-called Ulfbert inlays
Mhm.
that most people have probably heard of. Maybe even if you're not into Viking stuff, you've heard of Ulfbert. Um, Nobody knows what Ulfbert means. There have been various suggestions. If you can solve it, that'd be great using your linguistic skills. But some of the suggestions. Probably the most popular is that it's the name of a smithery or possibly the chief smith at some smithy. It's also somebody has suggested it might have a religious implication, but I don't know what that would be because
I don't know.
we're
Part of what's
yeah
weird
go
about it is that it's of West Germanic provenance, but the Ulf part is North Germanic for wolf, right? It's not Wolfbert, which would be
right.
West
It's
Germanic.
really weird,
Yeah.
like incredibly weird. It's an incredibly weird thing, and nobody quite knows where it comes from. And there's reason to believe that these blades were actually made by somebody Frankish or possibly in the Rhineland region, uh, if that helps. But this is a sort of a thing that has confused people for a long time. Um, However, these inlays, it's not just Ulfbert. We get other kinds of inlays. We get a lot of geometric designs, including something that looks sort of like a D rune from Elder Futhark. It's not a D rune from Elder Futhark because we just kind of find it randomly thrown there, and it's a pretty simple geometric design, but it does show up an awful lot. Another common one from quite late swords is the phrase "in gelri me fecit." So I think that's Latin for "I in gelri made this" or something like that.
It's in Gallery made me.
Okay, yes, sorry. My Latin is terrible. It's been 20 years since I thought about Latin much, and even at the best of times, I was never any good at it. So, but it's very interesting. You get all kinds of different examples here. And so I've shown just a few of those here. The Ulfbert swords are also famous because of their supposed high quality. And Alan Williams has suggested that these actually used crucible steel imported from India, which is a distinct possibility. Like, that's very possible that they were trading with the Middle Easterners who traded with the Indians, or even maybe some of the Franks or Scandinavians went all the way to India. Who knows? But Alan Williams says, based upon the carbon content and his microscopic examinations, he thinks that this was crucible steel on some of the Ulfberts, but not all of them, because one of the interesting things about the Ulfberts is it's one of the earliest really well-documented examples of making cheap knockoffs. So we have a bunch of examples of swords where the Ulfbert is misspelled and the sword is garbage. So it's sort of like if you go down to, some seedy part of town and you buy the Gucci handbag instead of the Gucci
Right.
handbag or something.
Right.
So we
That's
get
pretty
that.
funny.
Yes,
Yeah.
but it's interesting because it shows that there was some real value attached to this name that people were trying to take advantage of by saying, "Oh, look, I've got an Ulfbear, so I can charge 3 times more."
Right.
And if the originals really were Crucible steel, then that could explain it, because Crucible steel is better. It's not like miles and miles better, like some people will claim that it's this just incredible different league of steel. It's not that much better, but it is better than Bloomery steel. On the other hand, there's another researcher named Petrie who has argued that Alan Williams' study is inconclusive. And he has some pretty persuasive reasoning for why he thinks that Williams' data is not enough to justify the conclusions that Williams wants to bring out of it. And I should clarify here, I don't know that Williams himself is like 100% saying that it's crucible steel. It's more people quoting Williams that are saying, "Oh, Alan Williams says it's crucible steel." He may have said this makes it likely to be crucible steel and been a bit more reserved about it.
Sure.
I don't want to speak for him. But there are people who will now tell you, yes, the Ulfbert sword was made from crucible steel from India. And it's like, well, yeah, that's a good chance. And that's really interesting. But there's also a good chance that it was made from just high quality Bloomery steel that was properly treated. And we don't really know the answer to this. So yeah, it's an interesting question, and I don't really know the answer to it. We do know that they really prized good steel. So this is a very long quote. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. And this is from the pre-Viking age, from the Ostrogoths. Theodoric the Great got a gift of some swords along with a bunch of page boys. And in his letter back to the person who sent him the gift, he pretty much ignored all the gifts except for the swords. He was like, thanks for this, and your swords. And then he goes on at great length about the swords. He says that the value of iron is better than gold if the iron is of good quality. He loves how well polished these things are. He loves that they've got a great pattern weld to them. He repeatedly goes on about the polish, in fact. And he even mentions that he was able to cut through armor with these swords, which I don't know what kind of armor he's talking about. I'm guessing he's talking about soft iron chainmail. And I doubt he could cut through it very well. But it is possible to split some rings of soft iron with a really good sword. Just, it's not, it's still going to be not nearly as bad as if you were just hit with a sword, right? But we don't know. Maybe he means he could cut through cloth armor. I don't know for sure. One thing that we can say, though, is that the Vikings probably had sharp swords. And you might think, well, that's a stupid thing to say because aren't all swords sharp? And for some reason, no, there is confusion about this. And I blame the Victorians, as I blame them for a lot of things. But the reason is because the Victorian age British did not keep their swords particularly sharp. And they extrapolated from this, I think, to the idea that no Europeans kept their swords particularly sharp. And then they met people from India and Afghanistan who had actual sharp swords. And they were like, wow, there's people who sharpen their swords. And it's this really weird thing. There are reasons for, so first of all, the soldiers didn't sharpen their swords until they were going on campaign. They left them completely blunt until then, or mostly blunt. And the Victorian era British Army used metal scabbards. So you can imagine what scraping the edge of your blade across a metal scabbard repeatedly every time you pull it out does to the sharpness.
Oh, sure.
It is not good for it. Now, the Vikings and most Europeans prior to this point used wooden scabbards, which are more work to take care of, but they keep your blade sharp. You don't dull your blade every time you pull it in and out. So there's a nice little video that I've linked there to demonstrating the difference between trying to cut through cloth armor with a blunt blade or a sharp blade, but not super sharp, versus a really properly sharpened blade. And we know from the sagas that the Vikings cared about the sharpness because they had people who were professional sword sharpeners, and you could even drop off your sword and get a borrowed sword while he kept your sword and sharpened it and took care of it and then gave it back to you, right? I cannot remember which saga that's in, but
That doesn't ring a bell. But I mean, you see whetstones being carried pretty often.
yeah, there's a ton of whetstones. What do they call them? Like, oh, slife stones, slipstones. Anyway,
Well,
yeah,
the
we see
sharpens-
those. I'm pretty sure the thing about the sharpening guy is actually mentioned in the Men of Terror book, so maybe I will be able to find that at some point, but I don't want to flip through.
Well, sharpen is whet, yeah, just like
Okay.
stone. And I think whetstone, the word that you typically see is brinstein.
Okay. I'm
check that
confusing
pretty
this
fast.
with modern German then, possibly. Anyway, I'll look for this later and see if I can find it. But there's definitely a mention in a saga of they were getting together at the thing, and one of the people there was a professional sword sharpener, and somebody dropped off his sword. I don't remember how this plays into the broader plot, but there it is. Yes, Schleifstein. Thank you, Pike. That's the word that I was looking for, and it's a modern German word, and somehow it got confused into my old Germanic vocabulary, which happens to me sometimes. I confuse. I think you've mentioned this in one of.
Hain is whetstone in Old Norse. H-E-I-N.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right, because there's the whetstone that's in Thor's forehead, right? That for some reason never made it into the Marvel movies, that he's got a stone sticking out of his head.
Yeah. Oh well. They're not keen on those kinds of details.
Yeah. Anyway, so the last thing I want to say about the steel is if you have well-made steel, it can be very hard and it can still flex a lot. So Emiliano Carrillo, a swordsmith who is actually making a sword for me currently, has made a sword that he said he can bend to 70 degrees and it will snap back into place.
Wow.
But if you do not use the correct steel or you don't treat it correctly, it can easily snap or just stay bent. So there's that saga where some guy goes on a trip and gets ambushed, and he keeps having to straighten his sword out because he's using his second sword, like his backup cheap sword.
Yeah, that does ring a bell. Uh,
I'm so bad at remembering which saga is which, and it doesn't help that there's like 8 different names for all 3,000 characters throughout the sagas. It's like everybody is
well,
either Gunnar or Thorkill,
yeah, right. Or
except for
Thorstein.
Egil. Egil is like the only Egil, but every other name is like,
No, there's two Egil sagas.
oh, you're right. Even
Yeah.
Egil is. I
Uh,
remember reading a passage in one of the sagas where it's like Thorkel and Vigdis, his wife, get into a fight with another Thorkel and his wife Vigdis.
yeah.
And I'm just like, okay, I give up. At some point, Thorgil beats Thorgil, and I don't know which one is which. Anyway, but yeah, so the flexing, somebody's actually asked this on Patreon before. Flexing is possible, but getting it bent and then having to straighten it back out again is also possible. It's definitely within the realm of possibility for the metallurgy there. Um, Now, another thing that is interesting is the way that they would make their grips. So there's kind of 4 different ways that they would make grips. One of them is that they would just put a thin oval piece of wood over the grip, sometimes made of several pieces of wood that are sort of joined together. They may have covered this with leather or linen, or possibly a layer of linen with leather over it, depending upon what they were doing. And sometimes they would add these vetrum to the ends of it for decoration. Another option is to just have a metallic, usually bronze, grip decorated with patterns on it that would just run between the 2 guards. So it makes it look like the whole thing is kind of one piece. And then the last option, and this one sounds really weird, is you just take the tang of the sword. The tang is the part of the sword that sticks off the blade. It's sort of like the tail of the sword. And you just wrap a bunch of wire around it and call it a day. You would think this is weird, but I've heard it's not nearly as uncomfortable as it sounds. So I just want to show a couple pictures of this. This is a really awesome example from Norway of a preserved sword. This is a type L. If we go back to Pedersen's typology, that has a wooden Karelian birch handle with vetrum. And I think it looks super cool. I love Karelian birch.
It's beautiful. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
very almost like kind of an ironwood type.
Yeah. So it's
looks
something about a genetic thing has messed up the grain of the wood and causes it to not have the usual grain. It gets this crazy pattern in it. I actually have it used on one of my replicas because it's so cool looking. And here's an example of the wire wrapped grip. Although the wire has gotten a little bit loose, but that's sort of the general idea on a very fancy sword found in Diebeck. I have no idea how to say that correctly, but that's my best shot. This, it's worth noting, is in the Statens Historiska Museet in Stockholm, and they put the upper guard on upside down. So originally it should have looked a little bit more like this picture on the right.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Huh.
But they put it upside down, I think because the pommel cap is missing, and so there's a big hole on that side of the upper guard, and they don't want people to just see the hole. They want them to see the decorated part. But normally that decorated part that is now on the top of the upper guard would actually be where your hand goes, and then there would be a pommel cap covering the hole like there is on that one over here. Also, this little triangular fleur-de-lis type shape is not part of the sword itself. It's part of the scabbard. So I don't really know why they have it on the sword when there's no scabbard. Yeah, sometimes museum curators make choices that I question why they chosen to display an artifact in a certain way. Usually it has to do with the fact that they've chosen to display it without any light, but yeah.
Just the ooh-ah effect,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they're trying. It's hard, right? Because, and I think Ian McCollum, who, by the way, I'm so impressed that you and Ian McCollum have done stuff together because he's one of my other favorite YouTubers. But he's talked about this problem with firearms too, right? Like museums are trying to educate the general public that don't necessarily know a whole lot, so they're not necessarily trying to put things on display for the expert.
Right.
But yeah, so it's a tough balance. Unfortunately, nobody in the Historiska Museet was willing to let me in the back to handle the swords when I went over there, so I wasn't able to do.
Should have gone with Ian.
I should have gone with Ian, or you should have.
You should have gone with Ian.
Is he over there now? Because I would love to. I don't actually know him,
so.
but
he's somewhere in Europe right now.
I mean, Finnish Brutality is coming up, right? So
yeah, I think so.
Maybe one day I'll be able to go there and I'll be able to meet Ian myself. But anyway, so those are some examples of the way that they would make the grips. Now, the grips also have caused a lot of confusion because they are quite small. They're usually between 8 and 10 centimeters. And if you look at this replica that I have, this is an 8.5 centimeter grip. And you can see my hand barely fits in there.
Yeah.
And people worry about this because they try to use this thing like a saber or like a late medieval sword, and they find that the upper guard keeps poking into them.
Mm-hmm.
And so people have tried to resolve how in the world did Vikings actually use these things. By the way, this is not just a Viking thing. When I saw some Bronze Age or early Iron Age swords in person for the first time, I was amazed at how minuscule the grips were, like really minuscule. And again, this is in the Stockholm Museum that they have these. It's a really worth a visit if anybody gets over there. Ranveig, I actually had this custom made to specifically fit the width of my hand, and I will talk more about why I did that in a moment. But suffice it to say that people worry about how did you use this thing without getting jabbed in the side of your palm. So people have suggested a bunch of different solutions. Amongst them is, well, there are some possibilities shown here, but one of them is suggested by a guy named Roland Varzeka, a German, I believe, at least he speaks German on his YouTube channel, historical or experimental archaeologist, and he's essentially proposed that you hold it in kind of an exaggerated saber grip with the pommel in your palm. And this is pretty comfortable. It will keep the pommel from ever digging into you. And some arguments for this, there are some later medieval treatises that do kind of suggest this kind of use of a sword. It lets you extend the sword to its fullest extent, like the tip can go as far away from me as possible. So it gives me the best reach. And it allows you to really do what he calls winding with the sword, which he thinks makes it look like a serpent. And he connects this to the fact that swords are called serpents. And he also, or Petri, who I've mentioned before, who is a student of Varzeka when it comes to sword fighting, has suggested that other weapons are better for chopping and cutting, so it makes sense to try to use swords in a way that works well for thrusting. Finally, Varzeka has noticed that some of the pommels are a little bit twisted with respect to the lower guard, and he suggests that this is to help them sit in the palm correctly. Now, I have a few problems with Varzeka's ideas, but I want to throw them out there because I think it's important that we study all the possibilities, whether or not we personally think they're the most likely to be true. So this is one theory of how the swords were used, that they were kind of gripped like this and that they were used a lot for stabbing. The problems with this theory that I have are I don't think late medieval treatises are a good source to use because the late medieval people had a very different mindset about combat. They were using differently designed swords and they had different armor. The asymmetric pommels is not to me very convincing because they really didn't care about symmetry the way that we modern people do when it comes to aesthetics.
Mhm.
So we tend to think that being symmetrical is like the first requirement for something to be good. They didn't care about that as much. I really wish I could remember where I found this picture of a sword hilt, but this is a very fancy decorated sword. This pattern of decoration would take probably about 300 hours to make. So this was not a cheap, you know, the poor subsistence farmer down the road is going to buy this sword kind of sword. This was a sword that was meant for at least kind of like a well-to-do farmer, maybe for a jarl kind of thing. And yet, if you look at this, the two sides of the upper guard are completely different. There's no symmetry here. I can also tell you, I had a sword made that was very similar to this one that Varzeka sees the asymmetry on, and it came out asymmetric just like this, but completely unintentionally. Like I didn't ask for that. The sword maker didn't try to do it. It's just when you try to fit a little hole into the guard and then slip that onto a tang, it's really easy to get the angle slightly off. And who cares? It doesn't really affect it that much. So I don't see the asymmetry as being good evidence one way or the other for anything. The other main idea for how the swords were used, and this is the idea propounded by Hrstvik in Men of Terror, and this is the one that I tend to think is more plausible. Although, again, I'm not saying Varzeka is wrong. I know this is the internet where everybody's supposed to be like, this person is just plain wrong and crazy. And no, I'm not saying that. He does great work. I really respect Varzeka, and I wish more people would do what he does. But I think Hrstvik's approach makes more sense because Hrstvik went back to the sources and they looked at the actual sagas, and they also looked at testing what would fit the way the Vikings thought. So one of the things that we know about the ways that the Vikings fought, at least from the little bit of writing we have about this, is that they really liked strong blows. 86% of the sword attacks in the sagas are described as cuts versus only 13% as thrusts. Not only that, but Saxo Grammaticus says that of old, in the ordering of combats, men did not try to exchange their blows thick and fast, but there was a pause and at the same time a definite succession in striking, the contest being carried on with few strokes, but those terrible. And that honor was paid more to the mightiness than to the number of the blows. So this suggests that they really cared about how strong you can hit rather than about like really fast movements of the sword, like whatever that means. So Hrstvik also tested a lot of different ways of gripping the sword and found that the hammer grip, as I'm sort of showing here, was the best one for delivering the most energy into your target and thus for giving the strongest blows. The other thing is that Varzeka's method for testing how this works in combat is essentially to engage in fencing combat with his fellow students, or he's the instructor, they're his students, but to engage in, mock combat. And that's great. You should absolutely do that. But the problem is that in mock combat, you're not usually trying to actually break the other person's shield or really like hurt the other person. You're just trying to tag them, sort of like a modern épée fight, right? In modern day Olympic fencing, you can score a point by just barely brushing your opponent with something that would maybe give you the tiniest like scratch on your skin. And I'm not sure that's very realistic in terms of how the Vikings would have fought because, okay, Varzeka and his opponent can like tap each other with the sword, but how much injury would that do to a person wearing chainmail? And yes, Pike Spy brings up a really good point. In Holmgangs, they would use 3 shields, and your goal was basically to split the opponent's shield 3 times, and then you could kill your opponent. Although personally, I think maybe it was designed this way to give you time to back out. Like you could say, okay, I've had 3 shields split. Maybe it's time to come to a settlement. And I can still say, oh, well, I was brave. I went into a home gang, but before we could finish, we decided to make amends to each other. Right? You can save face by having 3 shields split. And this is a good thing for society, because if somebody dies every time there's a fight, that's kind of bad. Like,
Right.
you run out of people relatively quickly that way. The other thing is that the pictures in the manuscripts really suggest a hammer grip. So I've given 4 pictures here from the Stuttgart Psalter from the early 800s in Germany. And they all really suggest the hammer grip that Hurstwick is in favor of. In addition to which, we also have the Tulwar connection. So this is a much later sword type used in India and Afghanistan in like the 18th, 19th centuries. And it's a very different sword blade, but it's a kind of similar hilt in the sense that it has a very, very confining hilt. You can really only grip it in a hammer grip. There's nothing else you can do, because it actually often has a disc pommel that literally forces you to hold the sword like this. And I do apologize, by the way, for my totally anachronistic scabbard. I just have a practical scabbard, not a realistic historical one. Historical nitpickers will say that the Vikings did not actually have paracord or anything like that for suspending their swords, but so sue me, I haven't had the chance to make that. So the reason that I mentioned the Tulwar is obviously there's no direct connection between the Vikings and 18th century India. However, they have very similar grips, and we know how the Indians used their swords. They used them with these full body, really powerful cuts. And part of the reason we know this is because Europeans who visited really respected and feared these Tulwar swordsmen, because they could deliver such ferocious cuts. So that sounds to me very similar to what the Vikings were focused on. The other thing is that if you hold the sword like this, it's very difficult to see. Then this digs into the bone at the base of my palm. But if I twist the sword just very slightly, it actually looks more like the pictures, and the upper guard is now pressing the fleshy part of my palm, and it doesn't bother me at all. It's true that I cannot quite extend the sword fully forward, but I can give really good cuts. And this actually makes the blade line up with the forearm bones in a way that I think is really, it gives me good bodily mechanical advantage for delivering powerful blows. And it's not at all uncomfortable. Like, this is an 8.5 centimeter sword. Now, I don't have huge hands. I'm in the 40th percentile, but a lot of the Viking swords were a little bit wider than this anyway. I deliberately had one made exactly to the width of my palm so I could test this idea out. And although I haven't had the chance to actually test cutting really, it does seem to be very comfortable to use. So my tentative conclusion is that Hurstwick is probably correct about the way that they use the swords. The last thing I should say about that, though, is it's really easy to change the grip. I can go from this to this and back again in an instant. I can even, as I'm delivering a cut, flip the sword forward and sort of cast it like a fishing line and transition between the way that Hurstwick holds the sword and the way Varzeka holds the sword.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no reason to think that the Vikings would have just held the sword one way. They probably switched it up for whatever they wanted to do at that time. But I do think that the hammer grip powerful blows was probably the way the swords were used, because the way these blades are designed, they're very much cutting blades, not stabbing blades. Okay, that was a lengthy lengthy discussion of how these things were used, but
I still don't get exactly why the grip is so small.
oh, well, I think it's actually because having it firmly on either side of your hand helps you keep control of the sword when your palm gets sweaty. It doesn't slide around.
Okay,
At least that's my theory. And it does give you a little bit better control because my fingers are against the upper guard and I can use that to help lever the sword around. My palm is at the upper guard, so I can lever the sword back. My hand is touching the lower guard, which is now upwards from the upper guard. And so, yeah, I just think that's probably why they did it that way.
Okay.
But I don't know for sure. Later on, as gauntlets became more of a thing in Europe, we start to see the longer swords. And we do also start to see smaller pommels as the blades start to taper more, and you don't need such a counterweight to keep the center of balance reasonable. But yes, you are not alone in wondering why that is. But I should also say, let me grab my 9.9 centimeter sword here, and you can see there's actually quite a gap there if I have a 9.9 centimeter guard, right? Like it's not as small as it sounds when you actually are holding it. And a lot of their swords were closer to 10 centimeters. Like I said, I did an 8.5 centimeter exactly to my palm for the sake of demonstrating the principle more than anything else. But yes, it is still a mystery. We really don't know the answer. If anybody tells you they know for sure how the Vikings fought, they are not correct. We have a lot of ideas, but again, it's sort of like the origin of the runes, right? Where did they come from? We have a lot of plausible ideas. We have very little in the way of conclusive evidence. And honestly, even if you came back from Iceland next year and told us, I found Egil Skallagrimsson's complete guide to sword fighting, I would, well, first of all, I would say, oh, this is another April Fool's joke, like the Otger video. But
possibly.
Assuming that we're, a real manuscript, that would still only tell us how one particular person during that time used their sword. It wouldn't tell us necessarily how everybody was fighting all over Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, Anglo-Saxon England, Francia. This was not like a professional uniform army where everybody went to boot camp and learned to do things the same way. This was you learn how to fight from your dad and your uncle or your foster father or whatever. Yeah. Anyway, if anybody has any more questions about sword use, I can try to answer them, but I think I've probably gone on about that long enough. So
it's interesting. I mean, that you look at it superficially and it's like, well, you have a sharp thing and you swing it at somebody, right? But when you actually consider all these different details of use and shape and whatnot, it's surprising how much nuance there is to it.
And I think that's probably, I mean, I know that you do a little bit of competitive shooting, and it's probably pretty similar where somebody who's never shot a firearm before says, well, you point it at the target and you go bang, right?
Right.
But
it's like, what's challenging about this? Yeah.
There's a lot more to it than that. And I have never done a competition. I've only done a very little bit of shooting myself, but I know that it is much harder than it looked. And there's a lot more to it than you would think at first glance.
Right. Especially when you're flipping over bars and stuff between.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Which is also why, by the way, people debate about qualities of swords between, like, was this steel better than that steel? And the answer is ultimately, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, right.
Like, it makes such a minute difference that what really matters is whether you can use the sword correctly. It's sort of like these competitive shooters who are like, oh, yeah, I've got my rifle down to half an MOA. And it's like, that's great, but you shoot 10 MOA. So,
I spent $8,000 on my custom 1911, but, also probably a lot of similar, maybe in a medieval or Viking Age context, I should put market in quotations, market forces are probably coming to bear here because, you're at the counter, as it were, and someone says, oh, the steel is, 10% harder than the stuff that, the slightly poorer guy has. Look how nicely this, look how nicely this slices right here. Ooh, look at like there's a lot of just sort of counter appeal.
Exactly. I mean, that's why we get the Ulfberht counterfeits, right? Because people are looking to trade on the name and say, yeah, this is the better sword. You don't want that crappy sword down there. That's made of regular steel.
Right. I mean, Ulfberht is I don't know, it's the Wilson combat of its day or something. You don't You don't want to be just one of these plebes with your Glock sword, you know?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's that kind of thing. It's you want the Porsche rather than the
Yeah,
BMW or something,
yeah.
or the Volkswagen. That's the better comparison, maybe Porsche versus Volkswagen.
And then you
Um,
even have the custom thing, because I imagine part of what might have been a pretty, blinging thing to do would be to have your grip custom measured to your palm, right? To
so
have it
that actually
exactly.
brings up a good point because we think that the blades were usually made in continental Europe, but the hilts may have been attached in Scandinavia and probably done to the
Hmm.
measurement of a person's hand.
Huh.
Um, the hilts themselves may have even been manufactured in Scandinavia. Now, it's hard to say. I mean, maybe they made some blades locally. Maybe some hilts were already attached, but there's good reason to believe that they would import the blades and then attach the guards and pommel sort of when the customer came and say, okay, how wide is your palm? We'll make the sword the size that you want with the type of hilt that you want and everything like that. Sort of like,
That's
you
neat.
know, customizing your AR-15, right? Like what kind of foregrip do you want? What kind of
Well,
stock
yeah.
do you want?
Or I mean, actually, that I guess a pistol analogy comes to mind now too. So many pistols have interchangeable back straps they ship with now, or even all the
Yep.
grip panels like a BP9. Yeah. Huh.
Yeah. Or now they even on the slide, they'll have like you can put on whatever optics you want and
Right. Right.
all kinds of things, right? So, yes. And one of the things that we know also would happen is you would have a sword, one of the guards would break or something, and you would have it replaced, sometimes with
Hmm.
one that doesn't match. So,
So there's
and
a little bit of modularity to it, and probably
yes.
a really good salesman of this type of thing would have lots of hilts on hand. It's like, well, I'll mix and match for you, something
Yeah,
like that maybe.
exactly. Now, not really deliberate modularity. It would be more like if something breaks, we can replace it. Modularity. So I say this because Japanese swords you can actually disassemble, and they're like true modularity, right? You can take off the tsuba and put a different one on, and all this different stuff. I think could be wrong. I'm not really into Japanese swords, but my understanding is that you can disassemble them and put them back together. Pike is saying yes, you can. So um, I'm going to go with yes, you can interchange a lot of the parts. Now, these European swords, they would have been like riveted and peened into place. But if something went wrong, you could still get a metal worker to undo the peen, undo the rivets, and replace the parts. It just wouldn't be the sort of thing that your average Viking could just do in the middle of a sea journey. Uh, you know, it was very much a blacksmith job to fix something up like this.
Right, but it's still doable. I mean,
Yeah.
that's interesting. I mean, it's I guess also part of what I'm seeing here is a little bit more of a well, like I said, a market or quote unquote market in swords. Um, because obviously there have to be people who are, professionally selling these things at least part of the time,
Yep.
and they're probably, trying to create some of the demand that they're taking advantage of, right? And that probably has a lot to do with like all the garnets and whatever, and then different pommel shapes and whatever
Oh,
might just be
absolutely.
fashionable at different times. Yeah.
And that's actually one of the things that I do want to, if we have time, show some of the examples of all the fancy decorations that progressed through the Viking Age, because you get into some really intricate decorations.
Okay.
Um, Really quick before we do that, I do just want to mention I talked before about Peterson's typology, and that there might be some refinements to it that are possible. For instance, I myself cannot tell the difference between a type R and a type S. I swear that these are the same picture. I mean, obviously they're slightly different pictures, but like I can't tell the difference. If you show me a sword, I'm like, that's either a type R or a type S, and I cannot for the life of me tell the difference. Another question, and this was brought up by Fedor Androshuk, whose book I mentioned before as being impossible to get. It's not just unavailable in America, by the way. I asked them at the History Museum in Stockholm, and they said there are none available in all of Sweden. And I said, maybe you should print more. And they didn't really have a good response. I didn't say it quite like that. I'm much nicer when I'm talking to somebody than I sound. But anyway, so Type H's and type I's, if we go back to this page, you can see that they look really similar. The type H is over here, the type I is over here. The main difference is that the type H, of which this is a replica, is much thicker in this direction than the type I's tend to be.
Okay.
So Androshuk said, well, we should probably just think about these as a single type, the H/I combined, because there's not really a good way of telling them apart. But as I was going through his data in his book, because he has over 800 swords in there for which he's recorded a bunch of dimensions, I noticed something interesting going on. And it turns out that there's actual significance to the dimensions of the hilt versus the dimensions of the blade on these H and I swords. And it turns out that the skinnier guards and pommels go with the less wide sword blades.
Huh.
And to me, that suggests that what they're actually doing is if you have a less wide sword blade, you want to make the pommel smaller so that the point of balance doesn't get moved too close to the hand. But you don't want to make it smaller in the way that people are going to see that it's smaller, because then people are going to be like, ew, you've got a small pommel. Nobody wants to hear that. And so what you do is you make it less wide. I apologize. I'm so sorry. My childish mind took over for a moment. So what you do is you make it less wide so that it's still sort of from this angle is just as big. You can still put as much decoration on there as you want, but it's not as heavy. And so you can see here a couple of the statistical analyses that I ran. We have an R squared of 0.15 and 0.1826, which shows us that we have a moderately good correlation between these measurements. And the P value is really, really tiny. So what this means, to summarize it for people who don't know anything about statistics like me, because I don't actually know that much about statistics. I'm a mathematician. I stay away from statistics. What this means is that there is less than a 1 in 1,000 chance that this is just a coincidence, essentially. Like if the originals had no connection between the measurements, but these are the ones that we happen to pick out to measure, and we got these results, that would be incredibly unlikely. So this suggests that the originals really did have some kind of a connection between the size of the blade and the size of the guard. And so my suggestion is that there's a link here. Now, Peterson thought that the type I's came later than the type H's, and Androshuk was saying, well, maybe that's not the case. And yeah, maybe it's not. Maybe it's just a question of some people wanted a smaller, lighter sword, and so they got a smaller, lighter pommel to go with it. Or maybe the smaller, lighter swords became popular later on, and they made the smaller pommels to go with them. Or maybe it's just a coincidence, and they happen to make smaller swords and smaller pommels at the same time. But I kind of don't think so. I think that this was about balancing the sword. So that is my major personal find, and I'm hoping to get this published soon. I just need to figure out where exactly one publishes this kind of information.
Yeah, I'm not sure what journal that would be, but presumably some archaeological journal.
I was thinking of going with a fairly new one called Project Forlog that is not really very well respected, but I don't really care because I'm not making my academic name on Viking swords in the first place. And
I guess so. Yeah.
They're kind of an experimental archaeology kind of group over in Europe. But anyway, so that is my major contribution, that the type H versus type I, it's not random. It's connected to how big the blade is, which I think is pretty interesting, regardless of the reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that's interesting about the different types, by the way, is that some of them are much more common than others. And where you look determines which ones are the most common. So, for example, in Sweden, over half the swords that we found are of the type H or type I. Whereas in Norway, it's only 23%. But Norway is the only place where the type M is relatively common. 20% of Norwegian swords are type Ms. So why is that? And then in Sweden, we see 7% are type B, But in Germany, 28% are type B. So again, what's the story there? Why were the Danes so obsessed with the type Vs? And why did the Swedes get so many type X's? And there's all kinds of interesting questions that we can ask like that. I have a few ideas about this. It comes back to the sort of socioeconomic conditions in these different countries and who's buying a sword. And do they want just a practical sword, or do they want one that's really fancy? Because if we look at these different types of swords, some of them are super fancy and some of them are super plain. For instance, this is what Pedersen called a Særtyp 1, special type 1. And this one you can see was really fancy decorated. It's got all this fancy silver wire on it. It's got these fancy plates put into the guards in the pommel. It's just a really fancy sword. And it's also got a pattern welded blade. So this is super fancy. But then you go and you look at a type B, which would have been contemporaneous with this Særtyp 1, and they're super plain. The guards in the pommel don't have any decoration at all, at least usually. They're just plain old iron. And they're relatively simple shapes. So again, we're talking about something where one of these pommels would have been super expensive and time consuming to make, and thus give you a really expensive sword. Whereas the type B would be something that an average blacksmith could bang out probably in a couple of hours. Or, well, I don't have a good sense of how long, but not very long for a blacksmith to do this work, right? So this is a fairly simplistic type. But we do actually find at least one type B in what we think was a chieftain's grave at the Valsgärde gravesite in Sweden. So it wasn't just that these type Bs were used by the sort of poorer classes. They did find their way everywhere. And then the type H looks a little bit superficially like a type B, but it tends to be really decorated. So it gets covered in usually copper, bronze, sometimes silver. And we'll talk in a bit about how that decoration was actually done. Then we get these type Ks that are super fancy, like this one here that was found in Hythabu on the continent. It's got Vetrum. It's got a fancy wooden grip that may have originally been either a fancy colored wood or maybe it was covered in leather. It's got this really fancy silver decoration all over it. And then we compare that to a type M, which again is just plain iron and doesn't even bother to have a pommel cap. Because why bother with a pommel cap? You don't strictly need one. So if you're just going for the cheapest functional sword, just chuck a couple of guards on there and call it a day. Mm-hmm. And so my thought is that maybe it was common in Norway, again, because they had poorer people who were looking to buy swords. Or it's just that the swords of poorer people were more likely to be preserved in Norway versus other places. Maybe in other places, the poor people just tended to like melt down the sword as soon as it was broken or whatever. And yeah, who knows? But it's interesting that we only find them in those particular places. Mm-hmm. And then we do also get these weird combinations that I was telling you about, where it seems like somebody must have made a replacement at some point down the line. So over on the left here, we've got something that looks like a type B, but it's got a completely different pommel cap. It's not obvious that it's different. But it's sort of clear if you know what you're looking for that this pommel cap doesn't seem to belong to this type of sword. Or on the right-hand side here, we have something that has a very fancy decorated type H lower guard and a very plain type B upper guard, and the pommel cap is nowhere to be seen. So probably what happened is we're talking about a type H sword that something happened to the upper guard and it had to be replaced. And all they had on hand was a type B something. Actually, I think that might be a type B from a lower guard. Androshuk said something about that. So we get all these weird little combinations and things like this. And the way that they're decorated is actually a lot of work as well. So one thing I should mention is that sometimes they would actually make the pommels and the guards out of antler instead of out of iron or other metals. And we do have a few examples of this. So these are taken from Androshuk. One of the interesting things about this is that the type B that's shown here also is the only example of a Scandinavian sword that has runes on it. It has some
Interesting.
runes scratched into the lower guard.
Hmm.
I don't know if that
Which,
was original with the sword or what, but
yeah, but modern popular culture makes it seem uh, much more common in the Viking Age than it was.
yeah, it does not seem to have been common to put runes on your sword. Now, definitely not on the blade, and maybe that's because the blades were being made down the continent where they weren't using runes, but it doesn't even seem like it was common on the hilts. So I do know of an example of a spear that had a bunch of runic writing on it,
Mhm.
but not swords. However, if you do make it out of iron, then you have to figure out how to decorate it. And one of the problems is that to attach the pommel to a sword, the way that a lot of people do it is you take the tang and you just pound it down. It's called peening, and it kind of rivets the pommel into place. But that's going to mess with whatever decorations you want to put there. So the way that the pre-Viking and Viking smiths would do it, this is why they have an upper guard versus a pommel cap, so that you can rivet the pommel cap over the peen, and all you see is a beautifully decorated pommel cap and upper guard. You don't see an ugly tang peen in the middle of your beautiful decoration. They would either use a couple of rivets or they might use a single U-shaped rivet. And then you have the problem of how do you actually get decoration onto iron? So nowadays we have various chemical processes for depositing various surface things onto steel and iron, but they didn't really have that back then so much. So the way that they would do it is they would actually chisel very fine grooves. We're talking about like 10 grooves per centimeter, and then take thin pieces of copper or silver wire, so soft wire of some kind of precious metal, and hammer it into those grooves. And these are three different suggestions for how to do that, taken from an experimental archaeologist called Moulanen, who has made a bunch of his own swords. You can see here the grooves and the hammered wires in this example of a type H or I, depending upon how you want to look at it. That's over in the Statens Historica Museum. And you can see how there's these fine grooves, and then you hammer the wire onto it. The hammer gets stuck, or the wire gets stuck in the grooves, and then the top of it flattens out. And it leaves you with this really nice, shiny, smooth, bronze coppered surface.
Mhm.
And so it just, it looks really good this way. But the problem is that if you do this, then somebody might think that you just cast the thing out of bronze, which wouldn't be a lot of work or very expensive at all. So the solution to this, to really show that you're wealthy enough to afford this kind of expensive inlay jeweling work, is to come up with fancy patterns of wire. So this on the left here is an example, a reproduction actually made by Lars Jensen. And the one on the right is an original Danish sword. And in both of them, you can see that the wires have been inlaid in this incredibly intricate pattern. So there's no way you could do this by just cheaply casting bronze or something like this.
Mhm.
And then here's another example of a fancy pattern where we have two different copper alloys together with silver wires. I also put in a table here showing the density of the wires. So they ranged anywhere from 8 up to 28 per centimeter, with most of them being between like 12 and 20. And then this is another sword. This one is from Gotland, and Lars Jensen told me that this pattern would take him about 300 hours of work to reproduce.
Wow.
So even if you're a craftsman working 10 hours a day every day, that's basically a month of work. And so as you can imagine, these patterns would really drive up the cost of a sword, I'm sure. I mean, I don't know that for sure, but I'm guessing you would pay a lot more for that than you would pay for something simplistic like a Type M with just plain old iron that nobody has to do anything to.
Right.
And then there's another way of attaching stuff where you can kind of see it on this Type S. There's this funny texturing. This picture maybe shows it better. So you see there's this like crisscross texturing. And Molanen has suggested that you can use this to hammer on plates instead of just wires, and he's made sort of a replica type thing there. And then here's a few more fancy decorated swords that you can see. So yeah, over time, the styles did change pretty substantially, but if we want to understand how they changed over time, we need to understand how to find the dates for the swords, which is pretty tricky to do because a lot of times you find a sword by itself. Maybe it's thrown in a river, and then you have no clue who threw it there or when. Even if you find it in a burial, we usually don't have people kind enough to put up a marker saying when the person was buried. Even if you know when the person was buried, you don't know if the sword was new. Was it an old sword? Was it the sword this person bought when they were young? Was it their grandfather's sword that they kept with them their whole life? There's all kinds of questions here. We can try to use pictures and manuscripts to help us, although this is a little bit tricky because the manuscript pictures are often not exactly photorealistic, shall we say. But that can help us. We can use runestones. So we look at the design on runestones. This is the famous Ramsund carving with Sigurd slaying Fafnir. And you can see that the sword looks kind of like one of these two swords on the left, probably something of that design. And this makes sense because the carving is early 11th century, and we think those swords are early 11th century. You can try to carbon date things in the burial, but carbon dating is often a little bit tricky and not always consistent. So you often get quite a wide range of times. And if you're really trying to nail down when did this come into fashion and when did it go out of fashion, then knowing something to within 100 years isn't necessarily super helpful. And then something else you can do is if you have something that's wooden, you can use something called dendrochronology, which is a really cool science. You look at the distribution of the rings in a piece of wood. And if you know what the climate was like in different years, then by measuring how big those rings are, you can match up when that tree was growing and figure out how old the wood is. So with all that together, this is Peterson's proposed chronology of these swords. So he suggested that the type A and type B probably started before the Viking Age and led into the type H and I, and also a few other types through the middle of the Viking Age. And then that separately, the special types led into the type D and E and into a few other types. And then that there were some independent developments like the type K and type L, which, by the way, those may have been more Anglo-Saxon that then got imported into Norway because those do seem to be more popular, especially the type L is more popular in England. So this gives us sort of an idea of how these fashions changed, but it's not exactly, there's contention about this. So Androshuk has given a slightly different suggestion for the chronologies here. It's not that different, but he's moved some stuff around based on his efforts to date the swords found in Sweden. Of course, it's also possible that fashions were different in Norway, where Peterson was primarily interested, versus Sweden, where Androshuk was studying. So maybe this doesn't reflect swords in general so much as how the swords travel around locally. It's really a big question. I don't have good answers for how can we nail down the chronology precisely.
Huh. I mean, this is an absorbing subject. I mean, it is, it always surprises me. You know, you turn over the stones and you see just how much is under them.
Yeah, it's tricky because I will start looking into one thing and I'll get caught up into something else that I'm trying to figure out with it. And it will, take me down rabbit holes for hours of trying to find out one thing and then another.
Well, and I appreciate you sharing with us the results of your rabbit hole digging. Could you show your reference slide there again?
Yeah, of course.
And Bjørn Gylfason is an Icelandic blacksmith that you've been?
So he is Icelandic, but he lives in Denmark. He's done 3 reproductions for me. He's also done a bunch of reproductions for other people, including that Type M that I showed, because I couldn't find any pictures of original Type M's that were any good. So yeah, so he's a very good blacksmith. Emilio Carrillo, whose slide I linked earlier, but he's not in the references. He's another blacksmith based out of Massachusetts who does some really good work.
Cool. I mean, I'm blown away by just the combination of archaeology, experimental archaeology, metallurgy. I mean, this is a complicated subject.
Yes.
Martial arts, I could throw into that. I mean, uh, really cool stuff here. And I might have to go see if I can track down some of these difficult to find books. But the time that I can give here is kind of coming to an end. So,
Okay. Yeah, I'm so sorry that this took so long. I should have warned you
it's
that
a
this
lot
was
of
going
good
to be long
information.
because there's a lot to
No,
talk about here, as you can see.
I just regret that I'm not going to be able to have like a long question and answer session. Does anyone have a question that you want to pitch in at the end here?
Oh,
I
Pike
can only
asked
take a
if
few
the
more minutes.
Vikings loved buying, stealing Frankish swords. Yes, that does appear to be true. So, as I said, it seems like most of the swords were made on the continent and then either traded or otherwise brought back to Scandinavia. So, either traded by merchants or traded to avoid getting your town pillaged by Vikings or just pillaged by Vikings and then brought back to Scandinavia. But yes, the general consensus is that the Scandinavians didn't make most of their own swords. It seems as though making a sword is a much harder thing to do as a blacksmith than most other types of weapons. It requires really high quality steel by comparison to an axe or a spear. An axe or a spear is just a small piece of steel. You can have it not be super high quality. It just won't ever be under enough stress to care. Well, okay, you still need high quality steel, but it's not as hard to make. But the sword is one that is particularly tricky. So it takes a particularly skilled blacksmith, and it seems like the Norse just never developed that as much. Or maybe they did, and we just haven't found the evidence for it. But it does seem like, I mean, if you're able to get them in trade from the Franks, why bother doing it yourself?
Right.
Particularly if you can just sail down there and pick up a few swords in exchange for not sacking Paris or something.
And if there's maybe not enough of a market in any particular local community for someone to really
Right,
profitably go into
exactly.
it.
Like
Yeah.
your local blacksmith is not going to be able to make a living selling swords.
Right.
And all the time that he spends making a sword is time that he could have been spending making nails and tools and things that people are actually constantly looking to buy. Yeah, so it may have simply been kind of like in modern times where there are certain specialty products that it just makes more sense for there to be a few manufacturing centers and then ship it all over the world rather than everybody has their own local manufacturer, right? It makes more sense to have a few smithies. From a market perspective, it makes more sense to have a few smithies turning out these high-end products and then you trade for them.
Right. There can only be so many Gucci's or Ulf Ferrets.
Right.
Uh,
Are there
I,
other questions
makes,
that anybody has?
makes a lot of sense to me. And thank you very much for the reference slide. And also thank you, Stella, for sharing so many references in comments as usual. Thank you to Dr. Blake Winter for your time today, for a really enlightening presentation. I didn't know 1/100th of this. So it's very cool to see it laid out so well. And thanks so much for taking the time with us. And thank you,
Yeah, thank you
Patreon,
so
for
much
taking
for
the
having
time.
me. It was really an honor. And if anybody does have questions, feel free to throw them up on Patreon and I will get to them as soon as I
That's
can.
right. It's a nice part of you actually just being there in the community. Yeah. All right.
Yes. Although
Well,
I
I'm
will be
gonna.
moving in a couple of weeks. So at that point, there may be less quick answering. But
Well,
yeah,
good luck with that. Moving as
thank you.
hell.
It is. It's awful.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. All the best to you and to everybody else. And see you.
Yep.
If anybody's coming for Beowulf tomorrow, see you then.
I hope to be there. Yes.
Cool.
See
All
you
right.
all later.
All the best, everybody.